Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here on YouTube to have another video help you improve your chess game. We had prior videos which talked on the following subjects, which were bishop versus knight. The last subject was about piece coordination. And I've had other videos that talk about what makes the pieces powerful, sort of like from my book, Elements of Positional Evaluation. And I thought I'd follow up my last video by kind of bringing together a couple things. I want to talk about activity versus mobility. In the last video, we talked about some of the elements that make pieces strong, and activity and mobility are two of those. I have another earlier video that talks about the 4 things to help you evaluate an entire position, not just how good pieces are. And the 4 things there were the material on the board, the king safety, the activity of the pieces, and the pawn structure. So you notice there's an overlap there with activity, but a lot of people don't quite understand what activity is, and they hear the terms mobility and activity, and they wonder, are those synonymous? Are those the same things, and we're just using different words? And the answer is no. And the first thing I tell people is mobility is objective. We can measure it. Activity is subjective. It's up to your perception of what's going on. Activity is how much the piece is doing, which is generally subjective, while mobility is the number of moves that it has. So let's talk about mobility first, because that's the easier one to define and the easier one to see. So there's 2 types of mobility. The main type that most people know and they're concerned about is how many moves a piece has in an actual position on the board. So right now, for instance, if we look at the white pieces at the start of the game, only 10 of the pieces have mobility. The pawns, the 8 pawns, and the 2 knights. The queen, the king, the bishops, and the rooks have no mobility. They can't move at all. So one of the objectives of making your first moves is to give those pieces some mobility. So for instance, when white plays e4, now the bishop on f1 has mobility. The queen has mobility. The king has mobility. The king may not want to use that mobility, but he has it. In fact, if you want to create a kind of a funny Sui mate, we could try to get our king some activity here. We can play a silly move like a3, and when black brings out his queen, we could play king e2 and checkmate. That's what happens when we give our king some mobility. Okay, so anyway, e4 is creating mobility for the bishop. It creates mobility for the queen. It creates extra mobility for the knight. The knight now has 3 moves instead of 2, and it creates mobility for the king, which you probably don't want to use. All right, so you're creating moves. Generally, one of the big things I'm always telling my students is, why is a queen worth more than a rook? Well, the answer is very easy. A queen can move exactly like a rook does and more. It can move like a bishop does too. It can move not only horizontally and vertically, but it can also move diagonally. So that's how important mobility is. If you have more mobility, you're worth more. And what I also tell my students is you can apply that to the same piece and not just comparing different pieces. If we compare a queen and a rook and we say a queen's worth more than a rook because it has more moves, then the same piece is worth more when you let it do more. So for instance here, before we play e4, this bishop is blocked in and it's not worth as much. Once we play e4 and we give it some mobility, now that bishop has become more powerful. And after e4, that bishop is worth more than it was before you move the e-pawn. In fact, if you told someone you're going to play a game and you're going to give them odds that you're never going to move the e-pawn or the g-pawn during the entire game, that's also sort of giving them odds that you can't move the bishop on f1, because the only way to get out the bishop on f1 is either move the e-pawn or move the g-pawn or have them captured. If they're going to stay there the whole game, then you're in big trouble because you can't move the bishop. In fact, every major opening, no matter what it is, contains moves that eventually gives your pieces moves. For instance, every opening either contains an e-pawn move or a g-pawn move, so the white bishop can come out, and they also contain either a d-pawn move or a b-pawn move, so the queen bishop can come out. So for instance, if you pick a random opening, like let's say the Roy Lopez, then We've got e4, e5. Already both sides have solved that problem for their bishop. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. And, let's look at the main line. a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castle, bishop e7, rook e1. So far, the queen bishops are stuck. And now white's threatening to play bishop takes knight, followed by knight takes e5. So black usually plays something like b5, bishop b3. And now the most popular move now is castle among grandmasters. Just for the argument, let's do the older line, which is d6. Well, now that bishop has two different ways he can come out. And white plays c3. Why does white play c3? So that a couple moves later, after h3 to prevent the pin, he can play something like d4. And now we can see that all four bishops are able to play. They all have mobility because this opening contains moves for both sides that move at least two of those four pawns to let the bishop out. In this case, they move three out of the four pawns. Okay, so this is actual mobility, and we can count the actual mobility. For instance, suppose you're playing the Cole system, and here normally you bring out the knights first, following the principle knights before bishops. But let's say you want to bring out the bishop, and everything else being equal, you don't know whether you want to play bishop d2 or bishop d3 or bishop e2. Well, let's just count the mobility. Right here on f1, the bishop has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves, of which 3 of them are safe. e2 is safe, d3 is safe, b5 is safe. b5 is a little silly because he can just AWL you, attack you with something worth less with c6. But 3 of the 5 are safe. If we play bishop e2, now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 moves. And of the 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of the 8 are safe. Well, it's better to have 8 than 5. But what about d3? d3, now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You have one more move than you had on e2. Do you have as many safe moves? No, because the black pawns are guarding a lot of these squares. But you are hitting one of the most important squares on the board, h7, which is a good way to checkmate a black king if he's not careful. So bishop d3 gives you a little bit more center control over e4, and it gives you more mobility, 9 to 8, over bishop e2. So everything else being equal, just on mobility purposes, bishop d3 gives you more actual mobility. So what we've been talking about in my book, Elements of Positional Evaluation, I call this actual mobility, because it's the mobility that a piece actually has on a board when there's other pieces on it, and you're looking at a real position. But then I introduced something else, which we talked about in the earlier video, Bishop versus Knights, which I called potential mobility. Potential mobility is what's the maximum number of moves the piece on that square could have. Well, if we to do that, the best way to do that is take all the pieces off the board. And now if we put the bishop on f1, when the bishop is on any square on the rim, and I think I talked about this in the other video, the Bishop versus Knight video, if the bishop is on any square on the rim, it has 7 legal moves. If you don't believe me, you can put it on any square and count them. 5, 6, 7. If we move it up to a6, he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Whoops, 7. So the bishop on the rim is always going to have 7. If we go to the next inner core here of the next square smaller, and I would put a bishop on any of those squares, now the bishop has 9 on any of these squares. It has 9 potential moves on every square. If the board were empty and you put it on one of those squares, it has 9. When you put it over here and you move to the next square inside this square, now we go up by 2 more. We go up to 11. So all the bishop on any of those, what are those, 12 squares? Any of those 12 squares has 11 moves. And finally, we have the smallest square, the central squares on the board. And if we put a bishop on those squares and the board is empty, we get 13 moves. So it goes 7, 9, 11, 13. And of course, that covers all the squares on the board now. So that's potential mobility for the bishop. How about a knight? Well, if we put a knight in a corner, it's got 2 moves. 1, 2. If we slide it over 1, it's got 1, 2, 3. If we slide it over 1 more, it has 1, 2, 3, 4. How do we do this? Well, what we're really doing is we're putting a knight in the middle of the board, and we have this little constellation of moves that it has, 8 moves in the middle. And when you move it toward the edge of the board, some of those 8 go off the board. It always has those 8. Just the problem is some of them are off the board. Like we put the knight on g4, then 2 of the knight moves are to I5 and I3. But there is no file I on a regular chessboard, maybe on some chess variants. So moving knight to I3 or I5 doesn't exist in regular chess. So the knight on g4 only has 6 potential squares that it can go to instead of 8. As we move around the board, that constellation gets occluded by the edge of the board. If we make a little locus of all the squares where the knight has a certain number of moves, he has 2 in the corner squares. He has 4 in the 8 squares that are orthogonal to the corner, these squares. He has 6 moves. Sorry, he has 4 moves. We just went to the ones where he has 2 and the ones where he has 3. Sorry if I said it wrong, but 3, 2 in the corner, 3 orthogonal from the corner. If we go 2 squares out and we make a little pattern that looks like this, sort of a stop sign kind of pattern, these are all the squares on the board where the knight has 4 squares potential mobility. If we move in further and go to these squares, those are the squares where it has 6, and on these 16 squares in the middle of the board, putting a knight there has 8. We already saw that. If you don't believe me with the 6th, let's grab one of the 6 ones over here. 1, 2, 3. Whoops, don't want to actually move the knight. We just want to draw lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, potential mobility. Now let's talk about a rook. A rook has potential mobility of the same on every square on the board. He always has 7 along the file, and he always has 7 along the rank. It doesn't matter where you put a rook. It's always 7 and 7. It's always 14. Why is this important? It's really important because the more you understand about what pieces and what pieces can do, the more you can do things with them and the more you can handle them and the more you can make them powerful. That's why you do tactical puzzles. That's why you go over positional games. That's why you go over patterns. You're trying to learn what can these pieces do, and the more fundamental things you know about the pieces, the better you are. So, for instance here, this tells you if you want your rook to have the most number of moves it can possibly have, you don't want to necessarily move it around the board. What you want to do is clear out the files and the ranks so the rook actually has moves. All the other pieces, when you move them toward the middle of the board, get more moves. Even the king in the corner only has 3. But as soon as we move him out 1, now we have the maximum of 8. So it doesn't take long before the king goes up to his maximum, but in the corner he does lose some of his power. How about a queen? Well, a queen moves like a rook and a bishop. Can we just add up the number of moves a rook and a bishop has? Well, the answer mathematically would be yes, if the moves of a rook and a bishop are mutually exclusive. In other words, if every move that a rook can make on a square is different than a move that a bishop can make on a square, then the queen should have the addition of the rook and the bishop on the square. Well, can a rook and a bishop on the same square go to any of the same squares? The rook can go to all these squares, but the bishop who moves diagonally can't go to any of those squares. So that's never true. You can never move a rook and a bishop that's on the same square to any of the same squares. So therefore, we can just add up a rook and a bishop to get the queen's moves. Well, we saw a rook is 14 on any square of the board, and a bishop is 7, 9, 11, and 13. So now all we have to do is add 14 to all those bishop moves, and we got the queen moves. So 14 and 7 is 21, 14 and 9 is 23, 14 and 11 is 25, and 14 and 13 is 27. Queen has 27 potential moves when you place them on one of the 4 central squares if the board is empty. 27. Now, what is that? Well, it's kind of interesting. 27 is 3 cubed, and the number of squares on the board is 4 cubed. So the number of moves that a queen has in the middle of the board is 3, the percentage of squares that he can go to is 3 cubed over 4 cubed. Kind of interesting. Probably coincidence. As a mathematician, I don't think that would necessarily be true. But 3 cubed over 4 cubed seems like an interesting number. Whenever I ask people, how can a queen move? They say, a queen can move in any direction. Well, that's not true. Here's a direction. From E4 up to F8. Can he do that? No. Can a knight do that? No. Can a queen move like a knight? No. So a queen can't move in any direction. He can't move like a knight, and he can't even make moves like E4 to F8, but he can move like a rook and a bishop. He can move orthogonal. He can move diagonal. So he's got a lot of mobility. And of course, his extra mobility gives him more capability to do tactics like double attacks and things like that. It's easier to double attack with the queen than pretty much any other piece because of its high mobility. All right, but we started the video talking about activity, so now we have to determine what in the heck is the difference between activity and mobility. Activity is what the piece can do. So sometimes I like to create this position with bishops. So let's create a board here where there's a whole bunch of pawns on the board. Let's see here. We'll put a white pawn here, and a white pawn here, and a white pawn here, and a white pawn here. White pawn here, and a white pawn. Well, do I want to put another white pawn? Let's not for the moment. And we'll put a black pawn here, and a black pawn here, and a black pawn here, and a black pawn here. Black pawn here, and we'll put a white bishop here. And we'll put a black bishop over here, and we'll put the black king. We could put the black king on G8 or G6. I don't think it matters too much. So let's create a position like this. Now let's compare the mobility of the bishops. This bishop on A1 can go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 squares, and this bishop on F8 can only go to 2. But the problem is, what's the plan for white to activate his bishop? If he plays the only safe move, bishop to H8, white can just laugh at him and say, all right, I'll play bishop over here and get my bishop into the game. And unless white wants to try to sacrifice his bishop for a pawn, which probably doesn't work in most positions here, this bishop has more mobility right now, but he has less activity. Because after bishop h8 or a king move, it doesn't matter what white plays really, and black activates his bishop, now the bishop, after the bishop only had a mobility of 2, now he has more mobility, but he also has more flexibility. He has things that he can do, and the poor white bishop is kind of stuck where he really can't get back in the game. So this is an example where, it's a silly example, but it's an example where the white bishop right now has more mobility, but in the long run, he has much less activity, because activity is things that you can do. And here, he doesn't have really a lot of things he can do. He just has those 7 squares he can move back and forth, and most of them remain unsafe. And he has not a lot of easy ways to get out of that. Now, he could hope that black brings his king down and then brings his bishop down. If white does that, let's say white plays here and black plays here, and white plays over here and black plays here, and white moves over here, and black plays check, and white plays here, and black comes down. Well, maybe now if white is clever and black is not paying attention, white can get his bishop into the game and start to do things because black let him in. But if black's clever, he could probably stop him from doing that. Is this a winning position for black? I don't know. Let's ask Stockfish. Probably not. I would guess it's drawn with perfect play. Stockfish says, good guess, Dan. 0, 0, 0. So this is the difference between activity and mobility. Let's create another silly position. Let's put a black queen in the middle of the board. Let's try to mate black's king. So let's put a king over here, and a queen over here, and a rook over here, and a pawn over here. And now let's make the white king fairly safe here. How can we do that? Well, we can block maybe a rook with a pawn. We can maybe put a knight next to the king. And now we can give black a whole bunch of more pieces, maybe a bishop here, and a knight here, and a bishop here. A couple more pawns. Well, we don't want to block the queen, so let's put the pawns off of the diagonal where the queen can go to. Let's take the bishop off the diagonal too. Let's put the bishop over here so it's not blocking the queen. I'm trying to unblock this queen as much as I can. Okay, so let's say it's black's move here. Well, first of all, let's compare the mobility of the queens. The white queen, how many moves does it have? It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves. That's not a lot for a queen. Black's queen has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, plus 7 in this direction is 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So what we say, 25 to 5? 25 to 5. But what's the activity of the black queen? Where are his targets? Right now, the most important thing in chess, of course, is not getting, I shouldn't say the most important thing in chess is not getting checkmated, but checkmate is the thing that ends the game. And white has several checkmate threats. He's threatening queen g7, queen h7, queen h8. Well, you can stop queen h7 and queen h8 by capturing the rook. And you can stop queen g7 for one move by playing queen takes f6. But how do you stop all those mates? Well, in this position, let's make it black's move. Black's queen is way, way, way more mobile than white's queen. But white's queen's activity is some of the most important activity you'll ever have, which is to try to help checkmate the opposing king. And black's queen can, postpone that for a couple moves. He can play queen takes knight and then check with the bishop. But how's he going to stop mate in the long run in this position? So even though his queen is way, way more mobile, the white queen's activity is way, way more important. So you'd rather have the activity of the white queen here than the activity of the black queen. And even though the mobility of the black queen is much higher, his activity isn't necessarily higher. So let's ask Stockfish. Stockfish, if it's black's move, did I set up this position well? What's the thing? He says, white has mate in 3. After you sacrifice the queen and you check with the bishop, he'll go out of the way, and then no matter what you do, he'll mate you. So he gives the line, queen takes g1 check, king takes g1, bishop b6 check, king h1. If g takes h5, then queen g7 mate. Well, we knew that was going to happen. We set it up that way. This is what we call an ad absurdum example, where we're trying to show an extreme example of one queen who has very little moves and another queen that has lots and lots of moves, and yet the queen who has the tremendous mobility, it turns out that the other queen has more activity, or at least more important activity. So now we're looking again at the difference between activity and mobility. When they asked Garry Kasparov, how important is piece activity in chess? I think he answered something like, piece activity is everything. Why did Garry play all those famous games where he sacked the pawn and tied up Anatoly Karpov, or he sacked the rook and he beat Topalov in 1999, was it, or 98, 99? With the rook sacrifice? Well, he got tremendous activity for his army. He saw my whole army is active. My opponent's king isn't that safe. In return for my small material investment, let's say in his game with Karpov, he gives up a pawn. But, I get my knight on d3. I get all kinds of good stuff. His pieces are stuck on the edges of the board without a lot of things to do. So you notice that sometimes you can give your opponent mobility without a lot of activity. But much more likely is you're going to get mobility and activity. If your mobility gives you activity, then that's what you're trying to do. It's the same thing with space. I always use this example with space. The idea of space is to give your pieces more things to do. So let's create a position where white clearly has more space. All right, let's do that. More space. Black, you have your pieces on the other side. Well, let's move white's kingside pawns up one. Let's put the white pawns on the white squares here. Oops, didn't mean to put a king there. I'm trying to get a position where white has a lot more space. So we'll move them up like this. I probably should move them up on the other side too. Let's put all the pawns on white squares. All right, all the pawns on white squares. And yeah, we can't close off the central file, so We'll do something like this. All right, so one of the ways to measure space is the distance between where the pawns start and where they are now. So you can see the distance where white's pawn have gone to from where he started is way greater than the distance black has gone. The space that black has for his pieces behind those pawns is very small. For instance, if we put the black king over here and the queen over here and a rook over here and a bishop over here and a bishop over here, knight over here and another knight somewhere over here, and we'll put another rook over here or something, and now we say, oh no, white's king is in trouble, his pawns have been pushed up. Well, no, I don't think so. You know, if we put the white pieces on some nice squares here, put the rooks in the center. Okay, so in this position, white has more space, and more space is giving him more mobility. And the fact that it's giving him more mobility means black is completely busted here because black's pieces don't have any mobility and they can't get into the game. So here space is good because it gives all the mobility of the white pieces. And this is what space normally does. But suppose you misuse your space and you push all your pawns up willy-nilly and your opponent just moves all his pieces around your pawns. So now let's change the position a little bit. Let's put white's pieces on the edge where they don't have a lot of mobility. We could stick the rooks and the knights over here. Maybe put the queen over here. Put the bishop over here. Put the white squared bishop over here. Get rid of the other extra pieces. And now we'll give black the pieces in the middle. And now his bishops are going to be the good ones. We got to put them where, whoops, sorry. We got to put the bishops where they're not actually taking things off. That would be a little unfair. We just want him to have these strong pieces. All right, let's take the knight off of there. We'll put the queen somewhere menacing. We'll put the knight somewhere menacing. Take the other pieces off the board. And we'll stick another knight over here or something. We don't know. Okay, so now what's happened is white's the one with very little mobility and black is the one who has all the mobility. And even though white has the exact same space as before, that's why I wrote a novice note called Space is the Means to the End. What you want to do with your space is get the former kind of position that we had where you have more space, and then that gives your pieces more mobility and more activity, and that's good. But if you have more space, but unfortunately you don't use them to get more activity and more mobility for your pieces, I guess we don't want the bishop to be hanging here, so let's put the black queen somewhere else. Let's put it on d6. Don't want any hanging pieces. That's not fair. But even so, if we make this white's move, what do you think Stockfish is going to do for the evaluation here? I have no idea, but I would say it's going to say something like plus 20 or something, even with white's move. Does white have any piece he can take on prees? No. Okay. So here we go, Mr. Stockfish. What's the story here? All right, so he's looking 17 ply ahead, and he says black's ahead by about 13 pawns. Yeah, not surprising. He says white can play knight e4 and AWL the black queen, and after that everything just falls apart. So space is a means to an end. If space gives you more mobility and it gives you more activity, then it's doing what it's supposed to do, and space is good. If space doesn't give you that activity, if for some reason you misplay it and it gives your opponent that activity, like we see in this position, then it's not the final thing. That's why I argue in my book, Elements of Positional Evaluation, that space is a very, very real concept. It's just not a basic one if you're trying to measure how good your army is. It's a building block. It's something, it's a tool that you have to help you get this activity, but activity is the real goal. So the name of the novice nook is Activity is the Real Goal, or space is a means to the end. They're all both the same kind of thing. And that's what I talk about in my book and in the novice nooks and so on. Okay, so hopefully you learned something from today's video about activity and mobility. We will see you next time. Please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, and subscribe to the channel or like the video. See you then. Bye.